The morning I found out my grandmother had signed her house over to a stranger, I was standing in the middle of a Walmart in Biloxi, Mississippi, holding a box of birthday candles and a greeting card I'd picked out for her. 78 candles seemed excessive, so I'd grabbed a pack of 12 with little gold stars on them, and I was laughing to myself about it when my phone buzzed and a name I didn't recognize came up on the screen. The name was Trent Okafor. He told me his name slowly, like he was used to people needing a moment, and then he said he was an attorney and that my grandmother, Lottie Mae Beaumont, had executed a deed transfer 4 days ago and that as her only living grandchild, I had a right to know. I asked him what that meant. He said it meant her house, the one she'd lived in for 51 years on Azalea Drive, the house where I'd grown up for most of my childhood, now belonged to a man named Dale Prescott. I put the birthday candles back on the shelf. I never did buy the card. My name is Sasha Beaumont. I'm 31 years old, and I am a marine biologist working out of the Gulf Coast Research Lab in Ocean Springs. I've been studying seagrass restoration along the Mississippi Sound for 4 years, which is either very glamorous or very unglamorous, depending on how you feel about sitting in a John boat at 5 in the morning in rubber waders cataloging blades of thalassia. I love it. That matters to this story because it explains why I wasn't physically present for a lot of what happened to my grandmother over the past 2 years, why I was present in every other way I knew how to be, and why those two facts became a weapon someone used against me. My grandmother, Lottie Mae Beaumont, is the reason I became a scientist. She was the kind of woman who could name every bird that landed in her yard and identify a cloud formation before the weather service caught up with it. She kept a garden that her neighbors talked about like a landmark. She pressed flowers between the pages of encyclopedias and gave them to people with little handwritten notes describing what the flower meant. She gave me a pressed blue salvia when I graduated from high school with a note that said, "Wisdom, which you already have, and good intentions, which you'll need." She was the sharpest, funniest, most self-possessed woman I have ever known in my life. She was also 78 years old and had been living alone since my grandfather Raymond passed in 2019, and somewhere in the 2 years after his death, someone had slid into the space his absence created and started rearranging her world. That someone was Dale Prescott. I didn't know Dale Prescott existed until that phone call in the Walmart parking lot. That's the part that still gets me when I think about it, because it means for the better part of a year, my grandmother had been mentioning this man to my mother, to my Aunt Cheryl, to anybody in the family who still called regularly. And not a single one of them thought to mention him to me. My mother, Sandra Beaumont, called him a nice gentleman who helped Grandma with errands. My Aunt Cheryl called him a good Christian man. My cousin Wren, who is 23 and lives in New Orleans and constitutes herself a very online person, sent me a string of emojis I couldn't fully interpret when I texted her about it. Whatever Dale Prescott was, my family had apparently decided he was fine, and I had been in the dark, running water quality tests and writing grant reports, completely unaware that a man I'd never heard of was becoming the most important person in my grandmother's daily life. I drove to Azalea Drive that same afternoon. The house looked the same from the road. White clapboard, green shutters, the big live oak in the front yard that had been there longer than anyone could remember. Grandma's wind chimes were still on the porch, the copper ones Raymond had bought at a craft fair in Hattiesburg the year they turned 60. But when I knocked and the door opened, there was a man I had never seen standing in my grandmother's kitchen doorway drying his hands on a dish towel like it was his dish towel, like it was his kitchen. He was maybe 60, broad through the shoulders, with a very deliberate kind of smile. The kind you'd describe as warm if you weren't paying attention. The kind you'd describe as practiced if you were. "Dale Prescott," he said, extending his hand. "I know who you are," I said, and walked past him toward the sound of my grandmother's voice. She was in the sunroom, her white hair pinned up the way she always wore it, working a crossword puzzle in pencil, because she'd been doing crosswords in pencil since before I was born and had never once needed the eraser. She looked up at me over her reading glasses, and her whole face changed into the face that has made me feel anchored to this earth since I was 4 years old. She said, "Sasha, baby," as if she'd been expecting me, as if I'd been there yesterday. We hugged for a long time. When I pulled back, I kept my voice very even. "Grandma, I need to ask you about a phone call I got today. About the house." Her expression didn't go guilty or alarmed the way I'd have feared. It went complicated. She set her pencil down in the crease of the puzzle book and looked at me with those clear gray eyes and said, "I wondered when this was coming." Dale Prescott had appeared in her life 18 months ago through Grace Methodist Church. He'd started volunteering for the senior assistance program there after he moved to the coast from somewhere in Georgia. He drove people to doctor's appointments, helped with grocery runs, fixed small things around houses. He was consistent, and he was helpful, and Grandma liked him because he actually listened when she talked, which she told me with a pointed clarity that I chose not to take personally. He started coming by on Wednesdays, then also on Saturdays. Then he started calling to check on her every other night. When the hot water heater went out in February, he'd replaced it. When her car needed new brake pads in April, he'd taken it to the shop and paid the bill, and she'd tried to pay him back, and he'd waved her off and said she could make him a pot of her gumbo, and that would be more than enough. By the time I found out he existed, Dale Prescott had become the architecture of my grandmother's daily life. And my grandmother, who was sharp as a tack and had never in her life been a woman who needed saving, had somewhere along the way allowed herself to need someone. That part broke my heart a little, and I'm still working out why. Maybe because I should have known. Maybe because Raymond had been gone for 2 years and I'd been calling twice a week and sending packages and making visits every 6 to 8 weeks and telling myself that was sufficient, and it wasn't. Not the way Dale Prescott's Wednesday afternoons were sufficient. Not the way having a person present in a house that had started to feel too quiet is sufficient. I understood how it happened. Understanding it didn't make what he'd done with that access any easier to sit with. The deed transfer was real. I looked at it myself, sat in the sunroom while Dale excused himself to go walk the dog he'd apparently started bringing to her house, and Grandma explained. He'd told her 2 months ago that he'd been having some financial trouble, nothing serious, just some irregularities with his pension from the county in Georgia where he used to work, and it would be sorted out, but it was taking time. And in the meantime, would she consider holding the house in a kind of shared title arrangement, just so he had some collateral if things got tight? She said it in a way that suggested she knew how it sounded. She was watching me the whole time she spoke. I said, "Grandma, you transferred the full title." She said, "He told me that was the cleanest legal arrangement." I said, "Who is his attorney?" She said he'd handled it through a notary. My grandmother had a master's degree in library science. She had read more books in her life than most people would encounter in 3 lifetimes. She had made every financial decision in her household since Raymond's first stroke in 2017, and she had been entirely competent and entirely in charge. And something about this man in her kitchen with his dish towels and his dog had made her hand him the thing she had lived in for 51 years. I have thought about why. I think when you are 78 and the person you built your life with is gone and the house you live in is quiet in a way it has never been quiet before, sometimes the part of your brain that has always managed risk starts weighing risk differently. The risk of being alone starts outweighing other risks. The risk of loneliness becomes bigger than the risk of a bad decision. That does not mean what Dale Prescott did was acceptable. It means he found the exact dimension of her vulnerability and walked right through it. I went home that night and called Trent Okafor, the attorney who'd tracked me down through the county property records. He was a real estate attorney in Gulfport, semi-retired, and he'd flagged the transfer because he'd seen a similar pattern twice before in Harrison County over the past 4 years. Different man, different name, same method. He called it companionship predation. I'd never heard that term. He explained it in the flat, precise way of someone who has had to explain a painful thing many times. It is the deliberate, sustained cultivation of trust with an elderly person in order to gain access to assets. It is not always illegal in the conventional sense. It operates in the margins of what fraud statutes can reach. But it is, he said, without inflection, a form of theft. The theft of a person's autonomy, conducted so gently they often don't realize it happened. I lay in my apartment that night listening to the boats in the marina and thinking about my grandmother in that house. Thinking about the fact that for 18 months, while I was doing the responsible, adult, professionally appropriate thing of maintaining my career and calling twice a week, this man had been carefully, methodically replacing the support structure of my grandmother's life with himself. And my mother had thought he was a nice gentleman. And my Aunt Cheryl had thought he was a good Christian man. And I was the one who'd gotten the phone call from an attorney because I was in the county records as next of kin and someone else had decided I needed to know. I called my mother the next morning. I told her everything. There was a long pause on her end, and then she said, "Sasha, you've always had a flair for drama." I said, "Mom, she signed the house over to him." She said, "I'm sure there's an explanation." I said, "There is an explanation, and it is the one I just gave you." She said, "Dale is wonderful with her. You don't see how much she lights up when he's around." And then she said the thing that I knew was coming, the thing that had been building in the background of my relationship with my mother for the entire previous decade. She said, maybe if you'd been around more, she wouldn't have needed him. My mother lives 45 minutes from Grandma Lottie. She had not, in the 18 months Dale Prescott had been inserting himself into every corner of my grandmother's life, once raised a concern. She had not called an attorney. She had not looked up his background. She had not asked to see any paperwork. She had been present, physically present, visiting on birthdays and most holidays, and she had seen exactly what Dale wanted her to see, which was a helpful, cheerful man who made her mother smile, and she had accepted it completely. And now that I was the one raising the alarm she should have raised 8 months ago, she was using my absence as evidence of my unreliability. I was too far away to be trusted. I was making things dramatic. I was the child who had left for the Gulf Coast to study seagrass, and that choice, that professional choice, had permanently revoked my standing to worry about the woman who had raised me. I'm telling you this not to paint my mother as a villain, because she isn't one. She is a woman who loves her mother, loves her daughter, and in the space between those two loves, has always found it easier to manage conflict by softening it until it disappears. She is the kind of person who will tell you the sky isn't really storming, it's just being moody. She means well. She is also the reason I've spent most of my adult life learning to trust my own read on a situation, even when everyone around me is smiling and saying everything is fine. I called Trent Okafor back that afternoon and asked him what I could do. He told me the first thing I needed was documentation. Not of the deed transfer, that was already public record. Documentation of my grandmother's capacity at the time of signing, of the nature of the relationship, of any financial transactions that had occurred. He told me that elder financial exploitation cases hinged almost entirely on the pattern of behavior over time, and that if I could establish a pattern, I had something to work with. He also told me, very gently, that my grandmother would need to want to pursue this. He could not force a competent adult to reclaim a property she'd signed away. He said, she's going to have to see it clearly herself. Because my grandmother was not a woman you pushed. She was not a woman who liked being managed or decided for or rescued. She had very strong opinions about her own autonomy, and she had earned every one of them. If I went in too hard, she would dig in. If I raised my voice or issued ultimatums, she would close the door on me the same way she had once closed the door on a car salesman who'd gotten too familiar. I had to be careful. I had to be patient. Both of those things went against every instinct I had in that moment. The next 3 weeks were the hardest kind of slow. I started driving to Biloxi every weekend. Not making a production of it, just showing up the way you have to show up when something matters. I brought food. Grandma Lottie had always loved my shrimp and grits, Raymond's recipe, which I'd asked for and written down in my 20s, and I made it on Saturday afternoons while she sat at the kitchen table with her crossword, and we talked the way we have talked my whole life. About science, about her garden, about what she'd been reading, about the state of the world. Dale Prescott usually appeared at some point during those afternoons. He was pleasant to me in the way of someone who had calculated exactly how pleasant to be. He did not overstay. He seemed to understand, or at least sense, that I was watching. The second Saturday, I noticed something that I filed away. Grandma had a wooden recipe box on her counter, the kind with the hand-painted rooster on the lid that had been there for decades. Inside it, along with the recipes, she'd always kept a small envelope with emergency cash. She'd told me about it when I was a teenager, $500, always there, in case of a power outage or some situation where you needed cash on hand. I'd seen it my whole life. That Saturday, when I was reaching past it for a dish towel, I opened it out of habit. The envelope was there. It was empty. I didn't say anything. I took a picture with my phone. The third Saturday, I found something else. A receipt on her dining room table from a jewelry store in Pascagoula. A gold bracelet. $1,400. The receipt was in Dale's name, but the credit card charge was on an account I didn't recognize. I photographed that too. I called Trent Okafor on the drive home. He said, "That's a joint account." He pulled her into a joint account. I said, "How is that legal?" He said, "She signed the paperwork. Technically, she authorized it. The question is whether she understood what she was authorizing." I asked him what that meant in practice. He said it meant I needed to talk to her doctor. Dr. Vivian Marchand was Grandma Lottie's primary care physician. She'd been her doctor for 12 years, and she was exactly the kind of doctor you want when someone you love is getting older. She was direct and warm in equal measure, and she had zero patience for people who talked about elderly patients like they couldn't handle information. I had met her twice. I called her office and explained who I was and why I was calling, and she told me she couldn't share medical details, but that she would very much like to have a conversation with me and that I should come in person. I drove to Biloxi on a Wednesday, which meant I took a personal day from the lab, which I had not done in 8 months. Dr. Marchand sat across from me in her office with her hands folded on her desk and told me that she had been concerned about my grandmother's situation for about 6 months, that she had documented her concerns in the chart, and that she had raised the possibility of a capacity evaluation twice, and both times Lottie had declined. She said my grandmother was mentally sharp, which I already knew, but that she had observed changes in the way Lottie described her daily life. A narrowing. She said, "Your grandmother used to talk to me about a lot of things. Her garden, her books, her grandchildren. Over the past few months, she mostly talks about what Dale thinks." She said it without judgment. Just placed it in the air between us. I drove home and sat in my apartment for a long time. The following Saturday, I went to Azalea Drive and Dale was there when I arrived, sitting in Raymond's chair on the porch, which was the only moment in this whole story where something in me came close to breaking open. He stood when he saw me. He said, "Sasha, glad you're here." He said it like I was a guest in her house, like he was the one deciding who was glad. I smiled. I said, "Is Grandma in the garden?" She was. She was kneeling between 2 rows of begonias with a hand trowel, wearing Raymond's old canvas hat, the wide-brimmed one that had faded to a kind of soft gold. I went and crouched beside her, and we worked in the dirt together for a while without talking. That's something she taught me. You can talk to a person with your hands. You don't have to be looking at them. After a while, she said, "I know why you've been coming every weekend." I said, "I know you do." She said, "I'm not confused, Sasha. I want you to know that first." I said, "I know you're not confused, Grandma." She sat back on her heels and looked at the row of begonias. She said, "I was lonely." She said it plainly, the way she said everything. She said, "After Raymond, the house got quiet in a way I didn't know how to be inside. And Dale was kind and he was present and he was here, and I knew from probably the 4th or 5th month that something was off. But I let myself not know it because knowing it would mean being alone again." I put my hand over hers on the handle of the trowel. She said, "What did you find out?" I told her. All of it. The joint account. The empty envelope. The bracelet receipt. What Trent Okafor had told me. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the skills she had perfected in her career as a librarian. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The bracelet wasn't for me." I said, "I know." She pulled her hand out from under mine and stood up from the garden row with the deliberateness of a woman who has been kneeling in the dirt for 30 years and knows exactly how to get up from it. She said, "Call your attorney." Then she went inside and closed the door. Not a slam, just a close. Definitive. What happened over the next 6 weeks was the most legally and emotionally complex thing I have been inside in my life, and I've defended a doctoral dissertation on sediment composition to a room full of hostile reviewers, so I am not easily rattled. Trent Okafor filed a petition to void the deed transfer on the basis of undue influence. He had precedent, 2 other Harrison County cases with structural similarities, and he had documentation I'd collected, and most critically, he had my grandmother's own testimony, given in a deposition that she delivered with the composure of someone who had spent 50 years managing a public library reference desk. She described the 18 months in precise, unflinching detail. She described the way Dale Prescott had made himself indispensable, the way he had become the main source of her information about the world, the way she had gradually stopped calling certain people because he was there and calling felt redundant, the way the house that had been hers and Raymond's had slowly, so slowly she hadn't tracked it, started feeling like his. The attorney representing Dale Prescott tried to argue it was a consensual arrangement between 2 adults. He tried to introduce testimony from my mother and my Aunt Cheryl attesting to what a positive presence Dale had been. My mother had to sit in that deposition and describe all the ways she'd thought everything was fine, and she had to do it knowing that the paper trail I'd assembled made clear it hadn't been. She cried a little. I didn't look at her when she did. I understand why she didn't see it. I am not able to tell her I forgive her yet, because there are some things that take longer than 6 weeks to forgive. Dale Prescott's attorney also tried to call me unreliable because I lived 3 hours away and visited only periodically. He said, Ms. Beaumont was not a regular presence in her grandmother's life. He said it to make the jury, which was a judge in this case, picture an absent grandchild who had abandoned her family for a career. It was a specific, deliberate image. I watched him try to build it, and I thought about all the things that had been invisible in that picture. The calls every Tuesday and Thursday without fail, 7 years of them. The books I'd mailed every month since I left for grad school because Grandma Lottie liked to have something in her hands. The weeks of medical leave I'd taken during Raymond's final decline, sitting in a hospital room, reading to him while my mother handled logistics and Grandma held his hand. The 2 research papers I'd published that had her name in the acknowledgments, because she had first put a field guide to Gulf Coast birds in my hands when I was 7, and everything had followed from that. The way I had, for 6 weeks straight, driven 3 hours round trip on my days off to sit in the garden and document the thing none of the people who lived 45 minutes away had seen. I didn't say any of that in the courtroom. Trent said it for me, much more effectively, with documents. The judge voided the deed transfer. She found that the circumstances of the signing demonstrated sufficient indicia of undue influence to invalidate the instrument. She used that exact language. Sufficient indicia of undue influence. I wrote it down because I wanted to remember the sound of it. Dale Prescott left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. His attorney filed notice of appeal. Trent said it wouldn't go anywhere. The joint account took longer. There was a separate proceeding for that, and it cost money and time that my grandmother frankly didn't deserve to have to spend. In the end, the bank reviewed the transaction history, noted several transfers that predated any paperwork, and reached a settlement that returned the majority of what had been moved out. Not all of it. Some of it was already gone. The bracelet, whatever else had been spent or moved before I started paying attention. Trent said that was often how it ended. Not clean, not whole, but better than the alternative, which was nothing. My grandmother had a party. That's what she called it. Not a celebration of the legal outcome. Not a victory dinner. A party. She invited 30 people to the house on Azalea Drive on the first Saturday in November, when the live oak was doing the thing it does in fall where the light comes through it sideways and everything looks amber and gold. She made gumbo. She made cornbread from the recipe that lives in her head and nowhere else. She put flowers on every table. She wore the blue silk blouse that she wears when she wants people to know she is taking the occasion seriously. I got there early to help her set up. She handed me the copper wind chimes from the porch, the ones Raymond had bought, and said, "I want these moved to the back. I want to hear them when I'm in the garden." I said, "You sure? You've had those there since before I was born." She said, "I know. The garden is where I want to hear them now." I rehung them on the back porch post while she stirred gumbo, and there was something in the sound they made in the November wind that felt exactly like something being put back in its right place. My mother was there. She arrived with a pecan pie and was quieter than usual, which for my mother is actually quite quiet. At some point in the evening, she came and stood next to me in the kitchen while I was refilling the bread basket, and she said, "I should have listened to you sooner." She said it quickly, the way you say something you've rehearsed in the car. I said, "Yeah." She said, "I'm sorry." I thought about all the ways to respond to that. I said, "I know. I meant it. We are not repaired, my mother and I. But we are maybe at the beginning of the conversation that could lead there, which is more than we had in October." My Aunt Cheryl asked me twice over the course of the evening whether I'd ever thought about moving back to the coast. I said I lived on the coast. She said, "You know what I mean, closer." I said, "Aunt Cheryl, I am exactly where I need to be." She let it drop. Grandma Lottie gave a toast. She is not a woman who toasts, generally. She thinks they run long and that good wine deserves better than standing up. But she stood at the head of her dining room table, in the room where she'd sat for 51 years, held up a glass of the sweet tea she prefers to wine, and said, "I want to thank the people who saw what was happening before I let myself see it. And I want to say something else." She looked at me when she said it. All 30 people in the room followed her eyes. She said, "There is a difference between the people who are in a room with you and the people who are in your corner. If you are lucky, those are the same people. When they aren't, pay attention to the second category." She sat back down. She picked up her spoon. The party went on. I drove home that night with the windows down. November on the Gulf Coast smells like salt and wood smoke and something sweet I've never been able to name. I had a long grant report due Monday morning. I had a field survey scheduled for Tuesday at 5 a.m. I had 3 unanswered emails from a colleague in Tampa who wanted to collaborate on a restoration pilot. My life, the life I had built 3 hours from that house on Azalea Drive, was full and purposeful and mine, and for the first time in months, I felt it that way instead of as an accusation. The appeal Dale Prescott's attorney filed was dismissed in February. I found out through a text from Trent Okafor that said, "Dismissed, full stop." I was sitting on the dock at the research station eating lunch when I got it, and I read it twice, and then I sat there for a while watching the water. The seagrass beds we'd been working to restore were showing recovery along a half-mile stretch south of the station. Not fast. Restoration never is. But steady, measurable, visible to anyone who knew what to look for. Evidence of what happens when you show up consistently over time, in the water and in your family and in the places that need you. My grandmother calls me every Tuesday and Thursday now. She called me first, which means that's the direction it goes. I pick up every time. I drove down last month and we planted a new row of begonias along the south fence, a variety she'd been reading about that's supposed to hold through the humid summers better than what she's had before. We worked for 3 hours in the garden. Raymond's hat was on her head and the copper wind chimes were ringing in the back, and she told me about the crossword clue that had defeated her 3 days running, 17 across, 7 letters, a kind of silence. I thought about it while I tamped down the soil around the roots. I said, I think it might be respite. She tried it in her head, counting the letters. She said, you might be right. She didn't pick up a pencil to write it down. She's been doing crosswords in pencil since before I was born, and she has never once needed the eraser. You cannot love someone from a distance and call it enough. But you also cannot confuse someone's presence with their intentions. The people who showed up every day with a dish towel and a carefully constructed smile nearly took everything from a woman who deserved none of it. The person who drove 6 hours round trip on her days off, documented quietly, asked the right questions, and refused to let the story get written without her, gave something back that can't be fully accounted for in legal filings. It isn't always the people standing in the room who are standing up for you. Sometimes it's the one on the phone, the one in the car, the one knee-deep in seagrass 3 hours down the coast, paying attention in the particular way that love makes you pay attention, even when nobody in the room is saying your name. I am not invisible. I never was. It just took a very quiet, very sharp, very stubborn woman in a canvas hat to say it out loud in front of everyone who needed to hear it. If this story made you think about someone in your own life who is being overlooked or underestimated, share it. If you've ever been the one far away who still showed up in every way that mattered, leave a comment. And if you know an elderly person in your life who has a new, unexplained close relationship with someone you don't know, please look closer. It matters. Subscribe to Hidden Family Revenge for more stories like this one.